Hello there, welcome back to the Closet Historian. Today on how to build a vintage wardrobe, I wanted to walk you all through how I plan my vintage sewing projects. I plan my sewing one of two ways most of the time. Either I start with a design or a thing I want to make first, or I start with a fabric that I want to use first. So I'm going to go through the basic steps or like series of steps that I go through when coming from a very basic idea to a finished project. In some of the previous videos in this series, I've been talking about making lists of things that you want to add to your wardrobe, and sometimes you can sort those lists to things that you can buy or find reproduction or thrifter and things like that, and then some things that you can possibly sew. And so for me, that's always going to be part of the equation because I am a seamstress. There are going to be things on my list I know I can make, and so once I identify those items that I know I can make, this is the process I go through to make sure that I get those things done, or at least try to. So on my list, for example, I mentioned that I had 1940s long sleeve dresses and that I knew I could make those, so I will put that in sort of the category of things I can make. But how do I go from knowing I want a 1940s long sleeve dress to having a 1940s long sleeve dress or making one? This is kind of the process that I go through for that. So the first step I go through when deciding to make a new vintage inspired sewing project is going to be compiling inspiration, images, things like that, from either books, Pinterest, wherever, to get an idea of exactly the style that I am after, exactly what I would like to make. So different sleeves, different style lines, necklines, hemlines, skirt shapes, sleeve shapes, all the different things. Once I have an idea of what I want to make, I will usually sketch my project idea or like the details of what I want to make. You guys have seen me sketching here on the channel before. That's just kind of how I learned to do it over through fashion school, I guess maybe is what taught me to do it that way, just sketching first. But obviously not everyone draws, and so of course you can just pick out a pattern and kind of run from there. But usually I'll sketch things and then I will modify my existing patterns to that style and then use those. So I'm lucky in that sense that I can just, whatever I can sketch, I can usually pattern draft, which is super nice, of course, but I did pay a lot of money for that skill. I'm not sure it's really worth all the student loans to be able to draft my own patterns, but if you can do that without getting a degree, you should definitely figure out how to do pattern drafting without having to go get a degree. It's really expensive, too much, guys. I also keep a to be sewn list of my projects that I have coming up or that I want to do on a sticky note on my desktop, actually, the sticky notes app, not an actual sticky note on my desktop, but the sticky notes app on my desktop on my PC computer. I just keep a running list of the sewing projects that I want to do next. So if I'm like, what am I going to make next time? Which of course I don't ever get to all of those projects, but it's nice to have that visual somewhere where I can keep in mind what I wanted to make next. Because I've made so many things over the years, I have like a collection of bodice patterns with like every neckline and a collection of sleeve patterns and skirt patterns. So I kind of can just take whatever one out of each. Like I'll have a bag of sleeves and have a bag of bodices patterns, and I can just choose the sleeve that I want, choose the bodice neckline that I want, style of darts or whatever, and then style of skirt, and kind of just put them all together because they all sort of fit together all the time. Again, a great reason to learn to do pattern drafting because, if I know that I want a long puff sleeve, like this dress I have on, with a high neckline and an A-line skirt, I can just choose those patterns out of my kind of collection of patterns that I have laying around and put them together and make a dress pattern quite easily that way, mixing and matching and stuff like that. So it's really good to learn to do pattern drafting, I guess, as usual. I know I'm always saying that. It's not very helpful for people who are not interested in learning to do pattern drafting, but I get questions all the time like, what sewing patterns do you recommend? And I just have not used any vintage or sewing or commercial sewing patterns in a really long time. I always make my own, so I'm sorry, I can't be more useful in that regard. Once you have the whole pattern thing figured out, whether that's buying a commercial pattern or finding a vintage one or having a pattern drafting friend or something like that, however you have your pattern figured out, you can of course then select a fabric or textile for what you're going to make, based on, the more you sew, the more textile knowledge you will have. And I definitely recommend looking into learning about textiles and what fabric or what weave you want for which types of garments. Just like a silk is going to behave very differently than a cotton twill. Some things are stiff, some things are flowy, and for different styles, you're going to want a different type of fabric. So the more exposure you have to fabric, more exposure to clothes and what fabric is used for what, the more you learn about that kind of thing, the more useful that will be, of course, in your own sewing. For me, I've definitely was sad that this wasn't like a class in school. They didn't really teach us, when to use a charmeuse or organza, or like when to use a crepe fabric, when to use a twill, like different things like that. That's kind of harder to pick up on, but I think it's really important. So you should definitely try and find books or videos or even people in your life who can teach you more about which textiles to use when. That way when you're choosing a fabric for a project, how it's going to react, how it's going to drape and lay in the end, because that is very important to the finished look of your project. So once you have the design or idea, the pattern, and the fabric all in hand, of course you can get started, except wait, please pre-wash your fabric if you can. If it's a machine washable fabric, you're going to want to machine wash that first. If it's a hand wash fabric, if you plan on hand washing the dress or the skirt or whatever you're making in the end, hand wash that fabric first, because fabrics will shrink up a little bit a lot of the time, especially if it's a natural fiber like cotton or rayon, things like that. So you want to, of course, pre-wash them before you make your item. That way the fabric shrinks before you cut it out, not the dress or the skirt or whatever shrinks after you wash it for the first time and no longer fits you. So you gotta be careful with that. Always pre-wash your fabrics if you can, if that's the kind of fabric you're using, pre-wash. Which reminds me, you really need to make mock-ups if you are newer to sewing, or just anytime really you are trying a new pattern that you've never used before. You really want to make a mock-up to make sure that even if it says it's going to fit you, that it does, and it fits you the way that you want, and you don't have to make any adjustments. It's easier to make adjustments on a mock-up and on the pattern pieces than it is to make them on a final garment when you've already cut into your nice fabric and things like that. So always make mock-ups. I know it's not fun. It's like, seems like a waste of time and money, but if the end garment comes out how you dreamed it would, then it's worth it in the end. So once I have a project cut out, I usually like to finish the raw edges of the pieces. Usually I just run those through a serger real fast, or I will use rayon seam binding if I want something a little bit finer, a little bit more couture, a little bit more accurate of a finish on the inside of my seams. Before you sew pieces together, it's nice to have those raw edges taken care of, either again with rayon seam binding, serging them, by using French seams or a different kind of enclosed seam finish, things like that, just so you don't end up having things that fray on you or unravel on you. I definitely used to skip this step myself, but now I serge everything I can and rayon seam bind on things that I cannot on more delicate fabrics, I guess. So it's an easy thing to skip, but I think it's important for the longevity of your garments. And if you're going to be making things to wear for a long time and have like as sort of heirloom pieces in your closet, you're going to want to make sure they are finished nicely on the inside so that they don't come apart on you later on, or the first time you wash them or whatever. So finish those raw edges, guys. I've been sewing for so long, I just sort of know which step comes next when I'm making a project. So I know that, you sew your darts first, and then your side seams, and then put in your sleeves, and then sew the bodice to the skirt, and then put in the zipper, and then do the hem, things like that. So the order kind of becomes more natural the more you do it. So the longer you've been sewing, the less you'll have to rely on the instruction booklet, and more you can just kind of know what comes next. For me, because I've been sewing for a long time, and because I'm not using patterns, I kind of have to make up or just go off of how I know to put things together. So eventually that becomes a little bit more second nature the longer you've been sewing. Two things to remember while sewing a project, though, I think are pressing as you go, pressing seams open, pressing facings flat. Just make sure you're ironing and pressing and steaming as you go. Of course, you're going to be ironing all the wrinkles out and, finishing the garment, whatever it is, in the end before you wear it. But I think it's just good to get in the habit of pressing seams as you go, pressing pleats, just press as you sew. It'll keep things cleaner and nicer, and it's an extra step again, but I think an important one. So press your seams, you guys. And then the other big sewing reminder I have for you is to let your hems hang before you finish them. It's really tempting when you have a dress completely done except for the hem to just hem it right then and be done. But when fabric has any bias on it, the bias will stretch a little bit. That's just how woven fabric works. So you want to put the dress or skirt or whatever it is with a hem on a hanger, and then hang it from somewhere, or hang it from, put it on the dress form and let it hang for at least 24 hours or so that the weight of the fabric will pull that bias, whatever it will do in the end. And you don't want to hem it before then, because then your hem will be all uneven. So you want to let it hang overnight, then recut the hem to be, the same length all the way around, and then hem it. Just trust me on this. I have a couple of dresses that have wonky hems now because I skipped this step. You don't want to skip this step. Let your hems hang. Hem your hems. Hang your hems. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, when you've hemmed something, usually that means you are done. That's usually the last step. Maybe a couple buttons sewn on, or a hook and eye, things like that. But just the last finishing touches usually come at the very end of the sewing project, and then you have a completed item. Congratulations! You can add that to your wardrobe. It's a nice feeling. I go through essentially the same process if I start with a fabric as well, because I said in the beginning, I either start with a design or start with a fabric in mind when doing a sewing project. And so if I start with a design, then I end up choosing a fabric for that design. If I start with a fabric, say something from my stash or something I just fell in love with while at the store, I'll get a couple of yards, and maybe I don't know exactly what I want to make at the time of buying fabric, or when I see a fabric online or whatever. But I basically do the same process, same set of steps, just starting with the fabric first, and then choosing a design that will go well with that fabric, knowing the drape, the hand of the fabric, choosing a style of dress or blouse or whatever, based off of having the fabric already. So it's the same sort of series of steps. It's just a couple of them reversed for having the fabric first and the design second, or having the design first and the fabric second. So those are the two ways I sort of jump into sewing projects, I guess. So that's basically how I plan my vintage sewing projects, or sewing projects of whatever kind. Usually they're vintage based. Who are we kidding? I know for me it is a bit different because I make and modify patterns myself, which is not something that everyone can do. But again, I mean, I did pay a lot of money for that one skill by going to university for apparel design. And, you know, the jury's still out on whether that's super worth it, but I am very thankful to be able to do my own patterns. It is definitely a skill I'm thankful to have. I'm just not sure I needed to go to university to get it. So, you know, Google, books, YouTube can probably teach you to do a lot of pattern drafting on your own. So look into that. Or also, even there are sometimes technical schools will have classes on how to do pattern drafting. So look into that if that's something you're interested in. Or if you just can't seem to ever find the patterns that you want, might be time to learn how to do pattern drafting. You know, I'm a huge advocate for pattern drafting, so we know this. If any of you have specific sewing process or sewing adjacent questions for me, please do leave those in the comments below, and I will try to either answer them, point you towards a better resource, or even maybe possibly add them to a list of videos I will do in the future. And thank you guys, of course, for tuning in today, and I'll see you again soon. Bye. How I plan my vintage sewing projects.